I'm Kate Karlson, former reporter for the Binghamton Press and Sun Bulletin, and it's my pleasure today to be the interviewer for the three authors who are participating in the Writer to Writer fundraising event on behalf of the Samaritan Counseling Center. Our first author is G.L. Robinson, whom many of you know as Louise Donahue, a host of previous SCC fall fundraisers, who was a former French professor at Ithaca College and who began writing Regency-era romance novels following the death of her sister Francine in 2018. As girls in a convent boarding school, the two sisters giggled over romance novels under the bed covers. Robinson now has 5 romance novels in print, along with 2 children's books, adventure mysteries set in England and Paris respectively, which began as entertainment for her grandchildren. Hello, Louise. Thanks for being here. Tell me, what made you decide to write romances beside the connection to your late sister? What about their literary style, characters, or plot appealed to you?
Well, as you did say, my sister and I used to read them, and there's something very satisfying about these Regency romances because they all end happily. They're pretty much a standard sort of procedure. You've always got a handsome hero, of course, and you've sometimes got a not very pretty heroine, although usually they are quite pretty in the end. This is sort of, the ugly duckling syndrome is quite common in those. So they're very, you know what's going to happen, and there's something satisfying about that. And as I get older, I find even more satisfying than I did when I was younger, because life is so uncertain. And if you read something that isn't uncertain, then it gives you a sort of satisfaction. So what actually happened was the day after my sister's funeral, I find myself surprised saying this because it sounds like a crazy thing, but truly, I sat up in bed the day after her funeral and my first story came to me whole and entire. And I'm sure it was her. I'm sure it was her telling me the story. So I sat up in bed and started writing it, and I wrote, and it was done, it finished, that was it. And then when I'd finished that one, I just was full of ideas, and it's been now 2 years since she died, and the stories have been pouring out of me. I can't explain it any other way.
Well, that's splendid. Tell me, why do you think they're still popular? How do you make them real for, modern women in the 21st century?
Well, you know what? I don't think people really want stuff to be real. I mean, I know that there is a body of literature which is very realistic, and people, God bless them, they write it and a lot of people read it, and it's very good, and I'm not at all taking away from that. But a lot of us just like escapism, and it either takes the form of romances, like mine, or it takes the form of fantasy, like Buffy and the Vampire Slayers, or something like that, which is really, really popular amongst young people. And it's not realistic at all.
No.
And yet, if you go on Twitter, which I do, and I love Twitter, I think it's really fun, and all of the kids on there are talking all the time about, well, would a vampire do this, or what about, how should I make the love affair between my ghost and my vampire? It's not realistic, but it obviously entertains people.
Right. Well, let me ask you, you do address some Regency-era contemporary social issues in your novels. For example, child poverty and prostitution. Now, why is that important, and how do you work that into sort of the fun aspect of the novel?
Well, that's something that I will say the classic Regencies did not have. I don't know if you've heard of Georgette Hare, but she is the absolute classic writer of these novels, and I know her novels, I think, off by heart. Because I've reread them over the years so many times, but she didn't really get into contemporary issues, but I don't know if it was a deliberate decision on my part or whether it just happened. I'm not a planner, I should say that. I sit down, I have an idea, and I start writing, and I never know what's going to come out until it's come out. And so when I was writing the book Cecilia, which is about a tall young lady like me, who was brought up in a boarding school like me, and who thinks that she's never going to get married like me, and which was not true. Actually, I have to say I've got 7 grandchildren. When I was writing that one, I realised that Cecilia, being quite impoverished herself, would respond to, she actually ends up responding to one of the maids in the house where she's staying, who explains to her that she's very lucky to have gotten a job there, because if she hadn't, she probably would have gone into prostitution. That would have been the only other outlet for her. And so thereupon Cecilia decides to open this school. And I didn't know Cecilia was going to say that, or the maid was going to say it either, until they did, because I was writing it, but it, as I said, it just comes out. I really can't explain it any better than that. And so then I did a little bit of investigation and a bit of research, and so it did form part of a fairly important part of the novel, actually, in the end, that Cecilia opens up the school.
Right. We do associate Regency era, which was rather a short period, 1811, 1820, with these fanciful, carefree romances. Why do you think they're so ideal? That time period is so ideal versus later Victorian or something like Restoration, after King Charles regained the throne and the theatre was revived. I mean, they all have a certain flavor, a certain flair. What makes the Regency work for that type of story?
Oh, that's a good question. I never thought about it. I can answer about the Victorians, because of course we all know that the Victorians were terribly proper. They used to cover up their table legs because the word leg was sort of not polite. And to look at legs of any sort, it's true, was not polite. So they draped everything, and women wore, well, of course women always wore long dresses long before that, and actually quite a long time after. But so I would say the Victorians were too proper. What it was about the Regency period is that it was named, as you know, I'm sure, for the Prince Regent, who took over from his father, George III, when George III essentially went mad. He lost the colonies. He's the one that lost America. And the regent, the Prince Regent himself, was a man of loose morals. And also very sociable, loved parties and drinking and gambling and all those things. And I think this idea of a very free and happy society grew up around him. And that's why it's been really rich fodder for people writing those type of novels.
Great. And having visited Brighton and the Prince Regent's pleasure palace, party on.
Exactly, yeah, absolutely.
Well, I have a quick question for you that I will ask you not to think about. Just give us your off-the-cuff answer in 30 seconds, please. What makes you keep reading a story or novel?
I have to be interested in the characters. There has to be somebody in there that I'm rooting for. It's no good if everybody is the same sort of boring, dull person. I won't keep reading it. And it has to be well written.
Very good.
That's it.
Two-handed, two-handed. Well, now we're going to enjoy hearing you read from your latest novel titled The Kissing Ball.
So this is chapter 1 of The Kissing Ball, a Christmas story. The Branson family always held a party at the beginning of the Christmas season on the 6th of December, St. Nicholas's Day. Though some purists held that bringing greens into the house before Christmas Eve was unlucky, great branches of red-berried holly were placed in urns around the foyer, and it was the habit of the house to hang a ball of ribboned mistletoe from the centre of the entrance to the drawing room. This evening was no exception. A large kissing ball hung there in all its glory. In spite of its allure, The even quite recently married ladies sailed under it on the arm of their husbands without apparently giving it a thought, and the older married ones seemed so far from expecting any show of affection that being on the arm of their husbands appeared contact enough. It was seldom indeed that it occurred to any of the gentlemen, in either case, to kiss their wives. There must be something about marriage, thought Quentin Stapleton as he watched the arrivals, that makes a man impervious to his wife's charms. Only 2 or 3 years before, he reflected, the younger men and women then still sighing on the altar of unrequited love had doubtless looked upon it as an occasion to steal a normally forbidden embrace. Now, all passion past, the kissing ball might as well have been a cabbage. But it was still always fun, he chuckled to himself, to see how the unwed maidens handled it. The more timid of them tended to scuttle to one side of the wide doorway, thus avoiding the perilous centre, and the chance that a waiting gentleman might take the opportunity to plant a kiss upon their cheek. Not that they would so dislike being kissed. Most of them had never felt the lips of any man but their father or possibly an older male family member, and the thought of the warm imprint of those belonging to a younger member of the opposite sex did indeed cause a flutter in their chaste bosoms. But they were so afraid the matrons clustered around the edges of the large room, watching the comings and goings with eagle eyes, would stigmatize them as fast, that they dared not appear to court such an eventuality. The bolder young ladies walked quite slowly straight through the middle of the doorway, and might possibly even slow their steps just a little when the crucial moment was reached. Not to encourage any available gentleman, you understand, but merely to show that they didn't give a fig for the old-fashioned notions of the tabbies observing them narrowly through their lorgnette. If a young man did take the opportunity to snatch a kiss, well, it always came as such a shock that the young lady in question would utter a shriek and tap the kisser sharply on the chest with her fan before opening it and fanning herself as if she were on the brink of a faint. What none of the beauties did was to walk slowly into the centre of the doorway, right under the green and white ball with its red ribbons, and stand there, immobile, scanning the room, while her pink cheek, framed by a mass of copper curls held back by a diamond clip, presented itself deliciously to any comer. But this one did. Quentin Stapleton was certain he had never seen her before in his life. He would have remembered. She was rather above average height, with a delicious figure, over which her golden gown shimmered as if over the top of a very firm jelly. The lure was irresistible. He took 3 long strides and was by her side, and placing his lips on the aforementioned cheek, so wonderfully cool and soft, before either she or anyone else could move. She was certainly startled, but instead of striking him with her fan, she placed one shapely white hand on the lapel of his superfine long-tailed coat and looked up at him, her dark brown eyes wide. She saw a pair of bright blue eyes under a shock of almost black hair and a teasing smile. His black coat lay without a wrinkle over broad shoulders. He turned his gaze up to the ball of mistletoe and then down again into her eyes. She saw the direction of his glance and looked up there herself. "Oh," she said in a pleasant voice, "how silly of me. I didn't see it. I was looking for someone." "Then it's my immeasurably good fortune that you should have chosen just that spot to stop and look," replied Quentin. "I count it as a Christmas blessing." She laughed unaffectedly. "What an elegant thing to say, Mr. Stapleton, Quentin Stapleton, at your service, ma'am," and he bowed. "Well, Mr. Stapleton, I'm Laura Wentworth. I'm pleased to make your acquaintance." She stepped back and executed a rather cursory curtsy. "Whom were you looking for?" he asked. "I must say I hope he or she is not here, so you will talk to me." He drew her into the room. "My fiancé," she said. "I was expecting to meet him here. No doubt I should have waited for the butler to present me to the hosts, but he was momentarily occupied and I just wandered in." Mr. Stapleton's heart, usually a most reliable of organs and not given to somersaults or leaps, fell to his brilliantly shiny shoes. "Your fiancé?" he repeated dumbly. Who is he? Nicholas Branson. This is where he lives, isn't it? Nicky Branson is your fiancé, he said, unable to conceal his surprise. Yes. Why are you looking like that? Oh, no reason. I'm just a little surprised. I know Nicky well, and well, he never mentioned being betrothed to you. Well, he may have forgotten. It was all arranged so very long ago, you see, and I think our letter informing him of our coming may not have arrived. We heard nothing in return, but the post is very unreliable. And then Mamma has been unwell, and she couldn't come this evening. She's finding the cold weather quite a trial. She's completely unused to it, of course, and has a dreadful grip. Miss Wentworth, I know I must seem amazingly obtuse. Do I understand that Nicky may have forgotten he was betrothed to you, and the letter reminding him may not have arrived? Arrived from where? From India. Oh dear, it must seem a strange story. Why don't you sit down and tell me all about it, said Quentin, leading her to a small sofa set against the wall. I'll send one of the footmen to look for Nicky. He's probably in the billiard room. That's the end of the first chapter.
Hello, and welcome back to the Writer to Writer fundraising event for the Samaritan Counseling Center. I'm Kate Karlson, and it's now my pleasure to welcome Joseph Falank. Joseph enjoyed writing first as a hobby, prompted by his deep desire to be a storyteller who would take readers through a gamut of emotions in a single tale. He credits a conversation with his wife a decade ago in which each one spoke about what he or she had always wanted to be. Joe knew it was to be a published writer. He slowly honed his craft over the past 15 years, learned from experience, and now has one young adult novel, Seeing, and 3 adult thrillers to his name, along with numerous short stories. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you for having me.
The thriller genre has been described as the third leg of the suspense stool. Where mystery stories represent the most cerebral of the 3 major suspense genres, and crime stories the most dramatic, thrillers are typically the most emotional, focusing on the fear, doubt, and dread of the hero as he or she faces some form of what Dean Koontz has deemed terrible trouble. This genre is a hybrid of mystery and horror. So you write about things that scare you. Can you give us an example of what's lurking underneath the bed in your head?
Well, so the reason that I write thrillers, like you said, it's, scaring people. I think that immediately draws someone in. If I was to write about happy characters all the time doing happy things, it would get pretty boring. So I write about things that scare me because I've had a number of things that I've gone through that have scared me. In my latest book, Disconnected, I talk about an instance that actually happened to my son. My son was hospitalized last Thanksgiving. He came down with pneumonia. And so we started out at a hospital here. We went to Wilson. And then he was transferred to Golisano Hospital in Syracuse. And we were with him there for almost a week. So to take that experience, and then how I deal with it is to put it into writing. So in Disconnected, the father character shares this story with, I don't want to spoil anything, but he shares this story, and that's just my way of putting my feelings onto the page. And if I can do that effectively enough, then hopefully the people who are reading it, from the point of view of the character, care more about that character. So I think through fear and through not necessarily horror, I think that draws readers into that person's world, makes them connect with them a little bit more, makes them feel for them a little bit more, so that when good or bad things happen, they actually feel that, rather than just reading something that I invented and not being invested in it.
Right, there's that emotional anchor
Yes.
that you provide to a reader, and we're all part of the human condition, so we're all going to have one of those anchors to work with. Now, you've described your style as quiet and introspective, and which you hope will engage the reader to feel a part of that story, and whether through that empathy or identifying with a character. So how do you, in your craft of writing, accomplish this?
I don't use a lot of characters, and I don't use a lot of settings. I typically try to find 2 to 3 main characters that I'm always they're gonna be throughout the story, and then you might have a couple that come in and then they leave. And I'm hoping that everybody who comes into the story has something meaningful to add to it, otherwise why do we care? It always comes down to, I need everyone to care about what is happening. So I don't use a lot of characters, so that way you're not thinking in your head, especially if you put the book down and maybe don't come back to it for a couple days, because we're all busy, we all get tired, maybe we don't get to read every day. So if we're reading about a dozen characters and then we pick the book up after a long time and we're like, wait, I don't remember this person. So then you're flipping back in the book and then you suddenly realize, oh, I forgot everything that's happening. So I try to use only a few characters, and then I try to keep the settings very minimal and only a few, so that way when you're reading it, it's always in your head what's happening.
Great. What do you want a reader to come away with, either in heart or mind, at the end of your story?
I want them to feel a lot of things. I want them to feel joy for the characters. I want them to have felt their terror. But one of the things that really made me want to be a storyteller was a movie that came out called Signs.
Oh.
And that movie was marketed as a science fiction thriller. But to watch the movie, you learn that the family in that movie suffered a loss. And then each character had an interesting quirk that pays off in the end. So there was, like you said earlier, the gamut of emotions. That's what I want everyone to feel. That movie inspired me. When I left the theater after seeing that movie, I thought, that's what I want my readers to feel. I want them to be terrified. I want them to laugh. And I want them to care. And I want them to feel the joy of, in the end, when they have that revelation, I want them to come away with that feeling.
Great. And that's a great example of a science fiction story, and I'm familiar with it. How much into the supernatural / science, the otherworldly, shall we say, have you ventured in your writing? How do you make that work in your storytelling?
I try to do it as realistic as possible and not go too far into it that you feel like you've left reality. It's kind of on the fringe. My first book, Seeing, deals a lot with faith. So it's, what do you believe happened is kind of the question at the end. Do you believe that something that happened, was that supernatural or was it coincidence? I would say that my most supernatural story was my second book, The Painted Lady, which deals with an artist who meets this mysterious woman who brings out in the main character his ability to recreate art, but doing it without using his sight. He can close his eyes, create these works of art that then come back later in the story and mean something to him. So even though it is supernatural in a way, it still is anchored very much in what happens in everyday life.
It sounds a little Henry James to me. And that's a good thing. Where do you see that genre of thriller? It seems to be quite a big umbrella genre. What other avenues do you think you'd like to pursue through it?
Really, I don't really think too much about genre when I write. I try to just write a story that's going to make myself feel something, and then I know I can't write for everybody. I know I can't please everybody who's going to read something. So the most important is to please myself and to please my wife. If I read it and I feel like it's good enough, and then she reads it and she feels moved by it, that's enough for me.
Great. Well, here's your 30-second answer question. What's the best piece of writing advice you ever got, and how do you put it into practice?
best piece I ever got.
And how did you apply it?
So I can't say anyone specifically gave me one piece of advice, but I think I more or less came up with what I hope would be that good advice, is that you can't please everyone. You can only please yourself. If you try to please everyone else, you won't actually please them at all. You certainly won't please yourself. And I think to try to mimic anyone else's style is not going to work out for you. You have to write the story you want to write the way that you want to write it. As you develop more about your craft, your writing, you'll be able to find that you can create your own rules, you can break traditional writing rules, and do your own thing.
Great. I seem to recall a certain gentleman from Stratford-upon-Avon writing, "To thine own self be true."
Exactly.
Great. Well, Joe, please give us a sample of your writing from your newest novel, Disconnected.
As per their nightly tradition, John and Kara divided and conquered when putting their little ones down. On this night, almost exactly 24 hours before the serrated teeth of a most unimaginable terror sunk down on this unsuspecting family, one in the process of reconnecting, John put Morgan to bed with a story in a bedroom that she was excited to have all to herself. "It's got a chalkboard on the wall," she exclaimed, and asked to draw a quick picture of a kitty before settling in. While down the hall, Kara rocked Nicholas in a third bedroom with a pop-up picture book and a cup of milk. "Daddy?" John paused on his way to the door. Normally, Morgan wasn't shy or subtle about finding imaginative topics to prattle on about to stave off her bedtime as long as possible. But the concern and trepidation in her quiet voice spooked her father, raising goose flesh between his shoulder blades, and forced his paternal instinct to allay whatever fears were nagging at her, even if she was just procrastinating. He suspected his daughter would say something to the effect of feeling reluctant to sleep alone in a stranger's room, that this musty old house looked and sounded different at night, wondering if her room had been thoroughly checked over for spiders, or claiming that she was scared of the far-off thunder moving closer. But no, none of this. The little girl's concerns didn't meet John Price's expectations at all. "Yeah, kiddo? Why are you mad at Mommy?" she asked this, retreating slightly beneath the lip of her Paw Patrol comforter that they brought from home. The question struck him unprepared and vulnerable, as if his daughter had asked where babies come from. Morgan already knew. They came from God. At least that was the answer John and Kara were happy with her knowing. John went back to her bedside and sat down on the edge of the mattress beside her. He was conscious of not making light of the child's concern, or making it out to be preposterous, because children see through that act. Rather, he exuded puzzlement through a soft, sincere tone that showed more care for Morgan having this worry than the worry itself. "Honey," he carefully brushed aside the wispy bangs spiraling over her forehead. "What makes you think I'm mad at your mom?" The little girl sniffled, though wasn't emotional. The whole place needed a thorough dusting and deep carpet cleaning. The dust made her do that, John thought. Morgan looked to want to recede deeper beneath her covers. She brought the top edge of the comforter up to her mouth, slightly obscuring herself. "Because you don't touch her." John blinked several times, caught off guard by such an intimate statement. "Well, what do you mean?" "Like Nikki and me, you pick us up, you give us hugs and kisses and hold our hands, you tickle us." Morgan shook her head so subtle, wearing the most heartbreaking frown. "But you don't do that with Mom." Dumbfounded and struck mute for an answer, even a simple explanation to placate the child with, John sat and stared at his daughter. Was Morgan right? Had he been unknowingly neglecting Kara so much that their 5-year-old daughter noticed? And then was it even unknowingly? Had they just become so distant with all their work demands the last couple of months that their marriage, instead of slowly slipping down a shallow slope, went right over the bluff into stagnancy? Were they pushing each other away as a manner of coping with work stress and deflecting the irritations they felt from the increasing weights on their shoulders? She's right, he thought. "My friend Annie," Morgan continued, "her parents are always touching each other." "Oh yeah?" John said with a chuckle, a little amused. Morgan nodded, inserting an eye roll. I think they sleep all day. They always make Annie's sister watch us when they stay in their bedroom. Feeling he had to sidestep that particular landmine, John said, maybe they're vampires. He gave a wink and patted his daughter's legs. Time for bed, kiddo. He gave his daughter a second kiss on the forehead and told her she had nothing to worry about, in a hurried attempt to escape the room before learning anything else he didn't wish to know about the parents of his daughter's friends. I'll try to touch Mommy more, okay? Morgan seemed satisfied enough. I love you, Daddy. Love you too, Peanut. Good night.
And welcome back to this Writer to Writer fundraiser for the Samaritan Counseling Center. Our final author of the day is Therese Walsh. Therese initially wrote and did research for Prevention magazine before working as a freelance writer. Her first foray into fiction, The Last Will of Moira Leahy, was published by Random House in 2009, followed by a second unconventional coming-of-age novel, The Moon Sisters, in 2014. Her latest work is a nonfiction how-to guide for writers that highlights milestones and offers practical advice to overcome the most common hurdles and roadblocks to publication. Hello, Therese.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Your genre is book club fiction, which is defined as dealing with an emotionally complex issue through straightforward fiction. Do you agree? How do you achieve that goal?
I do agree. Interesting question. I didn't set out to write book club fiction, and it wasn't even really a thing when I started writing that I knew of. I had been writing children's book stories for a really long time and had yet to be published. And I thought I wanted to try my hand at adult fiction. And as an experiment, I thought I would try to write a romance novel because I had a friend who loved romance novels. And I thought, well, no matter how bad it is, my friend Polly will read this. So I just started to write, and I didn't have a lot of experience in, I hadn't done a lot of reading, or studying, how to write a story. And so I was sort of flying by the seat of my pants. And I came to learn later that there are two different kinds of writers, plotters and pantsers. And pantsers are the ones who write by the seat of their pants. And that's what I was doing. And so it was while I was writing a story that I intended to be kind of a simple love story that it turned into something else. It turned into this story of sisters and this story of grief and coming to terms with something that had happened and finding your way back to hope, kind of after a tragedy.
Right.
And so it was a long process. It was 5 years, before this story really found itself and found an agent and a publisher. There was a lot of work and rewriting involved. But after that, I did learn there is a thing called book club fiction, and that's really what it was. And it's when there's just a lot of depth. There's just stuff to talk about. And I didn't do it on purpose. I think it's just one of those things. Some people like literary fiction, and I don't think that that's what I write necessarily, but there are literary roots in what I do. So there's stuff to dig into and dissect and talk about in a group of people.
Great. Your two novels feature lead characters who are sisters. What interests you about that sibling relationship?
I have two sisters and no brothers, and so I think that's part of it. I was just steeped in the world of sisterhood from the very beginning. I think that one of the things that I definitely do play with in both of my novels is perception. And so that sense of like, well, I thought you meant this, and, well, I thought you meant this. And, that different people can hear the same thing, but interpret it in a different way. And how we come to sort of consensus or how we reconcile, after hearing things in different ways with one another. That's a big part of both of my books, actually. And it's a big part of the book that I'm working on now, the novel that's in progress.
Great. In an earlier Q&A, which is found on your website, You'd said that good stories are about conflict in one form or another, and that authentic happenings are not always comfortable ones. Could you give us an example of that from your work and how you avoid that pitfall of getting too comfortable?
Well, probably the thing that comes to mind the most is that in the Moon Sisters is a story of two sisters who are trying to come to terms with their lives after their mother dies in what seems to be a suicide.
Mhm.
And they don't know. And one sister vehemently, believes that it was suicide, and the other does not. And the problem that I had, the story is set up, you go from each sister's perspective, but we also hear from the mother throughout the story in letters that she has written to her father, which was the source of a lot of her pain in her life. And so one of the things that I had to contend with was that conflict between this woman, Beth, the mom, and her father, and this creation of this long-seated pain, and also to create in her this pain that might result in suicidal thoughts, so that it was something the reader would feel. And that was uncomfortable. It was very uncomfortable for me to go down that path at all. But I think that a lot of us have had hard times. And I think that it's okay to be honest about that, and to seek, truth in those moments, and to look for, comfort too, as we're working through them.
Great. Going to switch genre, if you will, now,
Sure.
because you are co-founder and editorial director of Writer Unboxed.
Yes.
It's an organization that addresses the craft and business of fiction. Could you tell us some more about that and how the first book, Author in Progress, contributes to its mission?
Yes. Well, Writer Unboxed was a venture that a friend and I began 14 years ago, which is such a long time ago. And just to put that into perspective, Facebook was a privately owned enterprise at that point. It wasn't even, it wasn't something we could join or so it just is sort of mind blowing that Writer Unboxed is actually older than Facebook as we know it. We pretty quickly, because I did work for Prevention Magazine, as you noted, I had it in my mind, that sort of drumbeat from Prevention Magazine, which was people like to hear positive and empowering information. That's what keeps them coming back to what kept people coming back to the magazine. And so I thought, well, how about this site be about empowering and positive information for writers? And it's just about that. And so we'll talk about craft, and we'll talk to authors. At that point, I wasn't published. We'll talk to authors about what made their stories work for them, what criticism they received that helped them be better authors, that sort of thing. So Author in Progress, I had, so you've probably heard of Reader's Digest and maybe have heard of Writer's Digest. Those two are connected. Writer's Digest is for writers, and there are conferences, Writer's Digest conferences. And so at one of those conferences, it was requested that I think about having them publish a book for writers that they would publish. And that's what Author in Progress is. And it really is, it's just the whole journey, like what it takes to become an author from soup to nuts. Every step of the way. Here are some of the pitfalls you might face. Here's how to pull yourself out of those pitfalls. So it's very positive, it's very empowering, and it definitely serves as a good face for Writer Unboxed.
Great. Sounds like a real must-have for any writer.
Thanks.
Here's your 30-second, don't think about the answer question.
Okay.
What piece of world literature of any era do you wish you had written, and why?
Time Traveler's Wife by Audrey Niffenegger is my favorite novel. I really appreciate her very unboxed, shall we say, use of time in the story to knit together a narrative that created some really compelling storylines. The stakes couldn't have been higher for the characters. It was beautifully written, very much book club fiction, literary fiction. And also I cried like I have never cried before for any book ever. And I just think that any book that brings that kind of emotion to the forefront is doing something right.
Right. Well, to wrap up, we have a real treat for our viewers because Therese is going to read from her current work in progress, which is titled The Lost Children of Stillwater.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to getting my head into these words again. I haven't seen this in a bit. There is at the center of the storm an eye, a place of calm, and surrounding it are some of the fiercest displays of a storm's power, the curve and spiral of the most guttural natural language known to man and beast. It's a great place to watch, if you can get a seat. I knew long before the storm arrived that this one would be perfect. Long before the change in the air, before Moma said she could taste Africa on the wind. She's the one who said it. The storm was coming to Myth Lake. The others didn't believe her. That thing? It'll die in the ocean. Too far away to say how bad it'll get down here, but nothing to worry about. If something were coming, the dogs would be acting up, maybe even the Zorse, Stillwater's second most popular attraction, part zebra, part horse. The Zorse is a difficult and unreliable beast, Moma said, and put her art in storage. The night the forecasters gave it a name, they all gathered in the Dunch to track its progress on the wide, flat screen while eating chicken fried steak on paper plates and drinking water instead of beer. Pell hadn't ordered a new keg, and no one ever brought a six-pack and shared it. They watched over the next few days, too, as Hurricane Chance laid waste to small towns along the Florida coastline and worked its way up through Georgia and then the Carolinas, lingering over the ocean just long enough to sip at its strength, refueling for the next strike. You might think that once a hurricane is downgraded to a tropical storm, that it would be fairly impotent, capable of rain, sure, and some wind, but not anything worth a worry, especially once it's moved inland, especially once it's reached upstate New York. History said otherwise. So did the barometer. They gathered again when the sky swamped over, and not in the Dunch either, not with all those windows. Rather, they poured into Tallulah's three-story home, part brick, part stone, and the only structure in Stillwater that none of them could imagine would tip or lift or crumble. And if the wind further eroded any of the old asylum's splotchwork of white and red paint, no one would ever notice to call it damage. The first 30 minutes was a show of unconcern for most of them. They played Cards Against Humanity in the wide pine kitchen, which was Mink's idea, of course, right up until the windows began to rattle and the power cut. Outside, the sky had turned to waves. "We should have closed the carousel," someone said. It was a time-consuming process that required multiple hands on deck to pull sections of an assemblable wall out of storage, then lock the pieces into place in just such an order, in just such a way. It generally only happened at the end of season when the weather turned cold. But no one had thought about it. No one had had time for the carousel once the governor's warning came down. They had all been absorbed with doing whatever they could to protect their own possessions and Stillwater's most vulnerable and critical structures, the tree houses. Fortify them with whatever wood they might find, even after the nails ran out. Stow what could be stowed. Gather as much of the rest as possible with flashlights and drinking water and dry goods, while mud-colored clouds shut down the sun and the air's dark tang spooked the dogs and sent the Zorse tearing into the woods. Vanished, not into thin air, but rather into air thick with clouds and electrical charges that consumed all light and threw back only dark. The storm was coming. The storm was coming. The storm was here.
Thank you so much. That was excellent.
You're
And
welcome.
I know the viewers probably enjoyed it as much as I did.
Thank you.